as we were walking out, several of you were asking, we walked past another big granite, or big stone. It's actually not granite, it's a sedimentary stone, but another big ledge over here. This is the tail end of another big spine of rock that runs for about half a mile north and south. And this is all glacial remains. So 12, 14,000 years ago, glaciers started to recede, and right here they created this whole Kickamuit watershed. And part of the way they did that is there's these spines of rock. So there's one there, come over here 100 yards, there's one here, go a couple hundred yards, there's another one, and they're just like set up like fingers running north and south. What's interesting to me about them is that they actually come up above the ground and then dive back down, go for about a half mile underground, and then come back up, and they alternate. So there's actually this really complicated geology here. And part of the reason it matters, I don't think, we can do it if you want, but we might get a little wet. If you were to walk up the side of this, there's a little overgrown, but a little path. You can see that there's a raised, big flat area right along the edge of this ledge, and then another smaller ledge that drops off. And my guess is this was one of the regular village sites for the Pokanoket in this area. And the way they worked things out, they didn't stay 12 months of the year in one place. They'd spend 3 months here, 2 months there, 5 months, different seasons. Usually organized around food and but also around weather. So this is, my guess is there was a village of about 250 to 300 people here, and the evidence is pretty good that this band of what later became called the Wampanoag, Wampanoag, was probably here for around 10 to 12,000 years. So they had a long, long history in this place. And my guess is, for the reason for being right there is it's incredibly protected area. The prevailing wind is from the southwest. All the storms we get come out of the northwest. And so if you had a village over here in bad weather, you're in pretty decent shape. This little rise of land, a little rise over there, and this overhang, the inside of that V never gets damp. It's a really, so it's a pretty interesting place. Roger Williams' heirs put up this little marker a few years back. I find it to be an incredibly complicated sign. So at the risk of offending somebody, which I do not mean to do, but just to because I appreciate that it's here, but it also makes claims about ownership and naming that just kind of historically a little problematic, right? So it says that here, by tradition, Chief Massasoit and Margaret, and the story is Margaret was one of the wives or the wife of Massasoit. Both of the Wampanoag tribe nursed an ill Roger back to health during the very cold winter of 1636, following his banishment from Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's true. So what happened is that in January of 1636, old calendar, Roger Williams was kicked out of Massachusetts Bay for heresy, and it was like the third or fourth warning. So this time they were coming after him to lock him up, throw away the key. He knew that, took off in the middle of the night, left his wife and daughters, and wandered around in the woods and got found by Massasoit and Margaret. He knew them from earlier meetings with them. He also had pneumonia and spent 3 or 4 months with them here, being nursed back to health, and then wandered down to what's now Providence, founded Rhode Island, or at least Providence Plantations. And so arguably Rhode Island wouldn't exist without Margaret being the person that nursed him back to health. Some of the other things that had happened is that by 1636, when this is happening, the Wampanoag in this area are really being decimated by smallpox and other European illnesses that have been brought over. There's a lot of European pressure on land and a lot of small conflicts happening. So by 1670, the conflicts are starting to really surface. Massasoit's son is starting becomes called King Philip, is starting to push back harder. The colonists, from my point of view, fabricate some conflicts and use them as an excuse to take away the guns that the tribe has, and to start making a variety of arguments about how they should behave themselves. What's going on in the landscape here is that pigs and cows, and to a lesser degree horses, are just running wild and scavenging everything up and profoundly reshaping the ecology of this area. So one of the things that surprised me when I first learned it is I always assumed that it was European colonists who built all the stone walls, the first stone walls. And apparently a lot of the tribes also got involved in stone wall building as a way to keep European animals out of their lands that they valued. So this land here would have been used for deer and small animal hunting. There's a flat areas here and down here that would have been used for farming. They did sort of a basic, what's now called in permaculture, the Three Sisters. So they would do corn, some sort of a bean, usually like a lima bean kind of thing, and squash. And if you eat those, it covers about 95% of the vitamins, nutrients, chemicals that you need biochemically to stay alive, right? So it was a really smart thing to do, and they had a way of doing that. So this was a really intensively used area, even though the Europeans coming in thought that it wasn't, because to them it just looked like nobody was using it. So they started fabricating stories about how it wasn't being used. The native, not only the Pokanoket, but all of the native groups up and down the whole eastern coast had a concept that now legally is called Usufruct rights. And it's very different than European land ownership. Usufruct rights means that instead of owning everything about a piece of land, I own the right to go blueberry picking, you own the right to go after the summer sweet, you own the right to go deer hunting, you own the right to pass through it to go shell fishing, somebody else has the current or historic right to use it to set up camp or give birth or burial. So instead of there being no concepts of ownership, which is what the usual European narrative is, there's actually these really extraordinarily complicated negotiations around who's going to get to use it for what. And so they saw the land itself as just a much more complex reality and a part of their lives than these newcomers did. But the newcomers kind of ran roughshod. Won't go through the whole history of the war. Obviously, King Philip's War, obviously the Wampanoag are deeply involved in that. The result at the end of the war, though, is that most of them have either died of illness, been killed in the war, or captured and sold into slavery down in the Caribbean. So you actually find Wampanoag heirs down in the Caribbean, arguably more than you would here. The few that remained, most of them, the story I've heard, I don't know if it's really true, but the story I've heard is that they went north to southern Maine and hooked up with the Penobscot, and for about 250 years after that, it was against the law to speak Pokanoket or to use Pokanoket names for yourself or your family members. So they were forced underground. Matters right now because they're also trying to get federal recognition. It's complicated federally.
How many approximately?
Because they're not federally recognized, you tell me. And you tell me what counts as a real Indian, right? So there's these...
They claim about 200, 250.
Yeah, so which would be the equivalent of one band. But that's one of the things they'll have to prove in court, and how that happens is really, it's going to be very contested. And
is that how the traditions were maintained? Theoretically, they went up to Maine and were able to maintain the traditions with the Penobscot?
This is getting a little off from Margaret's Rock, but kind of my short answer to that. What's happening with the sort of erasure of native culture here is happening nationally. And the more expansive the U.S. becomes, the larger that erasure is, right? And to the degree that by 1900, there's been a single generation that has been prevented from learning all of this history. So there's this little generational break. Huge amount of indigenous knowledge just starts to disappear. By 1930, there's this movement among a collective, huge coalition of native tribes across the country and into Mexico and up into Canada called the Pan-Indian movement. And the Pan-Indian movement is the recognition by a lot of the elders that if we don't do something, everything we know is going to be lost. But they take what they know and they begin to archive it, try to bring it back to life, do all these different things. But there's also these huge gaps. And one of the ideas that comes out to start to fill some of the gaps is that there's a kind of a pan-Indian identity. So that if I'm Anishinaabe from what's now Wisconsin and I'm a Pokanoket from Rhode Island, I actually share some things. That's a complicated claim to make. It's kind of like me saying, yeah, I'm a white guy from Rhode Island, so I'm just like my surfer buddy down in Los Angeles. You know, like, man, you know, yes, but maybe a little more complicated than that. So it's this really dynamic thing, right? It's just, and so one of the big issues in Native American studies since the field was launched, 1970s as part of the Indian rights movement, has been this question of identity. What counts as a real Indian? There's a very irreverent Native American author, Sherman Alexie, who writes about this, young adult books and adult novels, who's both hysterical and kind of tragic and really, really good introduction. So it's a good question, but it's a tough question. By 1680, at the close of the King Philip's War, very few remaining tribal members. This rock theoretically is named after Margaret because she nursed Roger Williams back to health, but also because legend has it, she was the last known Pokanoket to still be living in a historically home place, right? What I think about, though, some of the questions back to this, the rock is named after her, but it's also Roger Williams' shelter. So out of a 10,000-year history, it was his shelter for 3 months. And that's sort of the headline, right?
But that's significant to Rhode Islanders.
Well, which Rhode Islanders?
The declaration of...
You know, what I'm not so much making a moral judgment as trying to introduce the idea that this is, people are not going to be of one mind about this, right? Who does it belong to? Margaret is a Christian name for a native woman. I have no idea what her given tribal name was, or names, if it changed over time as it sometimes did. I'd really like to see, I wouldn't want this taken down, but I'd like to see there be an additional source of information out here, or something that just sort of opened up the conversation around all that. We should probably start heading back. We're going to get really soaked, I think.
That ship sailed.
Yeah, well, for you and me, but we're going to just go back out and around this way. If you are interested in talking a little bit more, we'll mostly have to stand because it's kind of messy and I don't have a lot of chairs, but I have a barn that we can open up and we can just stand in there for a few minutes and chat. So we'll just walk over and do that. One other thing before we leave that's just worth mentioning sort of physically. Supposedly about 300 paces to the west of us is a native burial ground. There's very little hard evidence that that's the case, but a lot of stories about 250, 300 paces to the west, there's a long time burial ground. So we're going to walk past it, but if you just look to the south, most of the rest of this farm, there's a total of about 350 acres. It was a single farm. There was a second farm over here that some of you walked out into. That's D'Alessandro's farm. Used to be part of this same farm. The D'Alessandro family bought it. This farm itself, when the Mason family got it in the aftermath of King Philip's War, I think they got it formally in 1696, but they'd been here for maybe a decade before that. that family owned it up until the 1940s. So the same family was here for 300 years. Legend, family lore is that they actually had a pretty good relationship with the remaining tribal members and allowed them to come out and stay here, hunt. There's a big erratic rock on the other side of the farm that the legend is that's where Pokanoket women often went to give birth, and women could still do that. So 1940s, the Chase family bought it, ran a dairy farm out here until the 1970s, almost 1980, and Buster Chase, Bob Chase, was the son who had kind of taken over that business right at the time that the bottom was falling out of the dairy industry in this country. It was Earl Butz and the Get Bigger, Get Out kind of movement, crushed the dairy industry in Rhode Island. And he did two things. One is he closed down the dairy and just went to vegetables and hay. And the second is he land trusted this, so it's all protected land. That's why it's not built. But in order to survive financially, he split the land and sold this north half of it to Charlie McCoy, who's a local doctor, and the Chase family's kept the other half of it. Charlie has a nonprofit that trusts this half of the farm. Chase family has one that trusts that part of the farm. I live in the middle of it on 2 acres of private land, but have a working relationship with all of them around the use. Most of the land right now is leased out to other local farmers, Four Town Farm, D'Alessandro family. But most of this right here is just butternut squash. You can see a bunch more off to the south. You'd be welcome to come out and just walk around. It's a gorgeous place on a drier day. So we're just going to cut through these woods over here and we'll be almost back at my place. So.
Grab a blossom on our way.